let's consider for a minute the music of what happened to the progressive rockers and the singer-songwriters in the second half of the 1970s in their music and how it changed and developed, and new groups that came in, new artists that came in those respective styles. It's interesting that in the groups from the first half of the 70s, the prog rock groups from the first half of the 70s, there were some important changes that happened about mid-decade. King Crimson, for example, disbanded in 1974, so we really don't have anything to say about them in the second half of the decade. In Genesis, Peter Gabriel, who had fronted the group from the beginning, now left the band after A Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, and after a long search for a singer, they finally decided they would use the guy who'd been the drummer in the group, Phil Collins. Well, maybe he'll be able to handle it, but boy, did he ever. I mean, Phil Collins became, when we talk about the 80s, we'll talk about Genesis and Phil Collins in the 80s. What a big star he became. But by 1976, with Phil Collins now fronting the band, they came out with A Trick of the Tail, and Genesis was basically continuing on, almost without feeling the bump of having lost Peter Gabriel. Peter Gabriel fans won't agree with that, but that's pretty much the way it happened, at least with regard to sales and concert life and the sort of the commercial health of the group. Emerson, Lake and Palmer were sort of at the very end of their tenure by 1977, releasing two big albums, Works Volume 1, and then the single album Works Volume 2 together, a kind of a 3-album set. They'd taken some time off to solo projects and to work on their own playing and various kinds of things in the decade. This was their sort of last big shot. Jethro Tull continued relatively unabated. Songs from the Wood, 1977, in many ways their proggiest album, or at least the one that has the most complicated arrangements in it. So Ian Anderson continuing to forge ahead. And Yes is back with an album called Going for the One, 1977, which had, you know, a lot of people, even Rolling Stone, hailed as the real kind of return for the band after some time off. They hadn't released a big studio album since Relayer, which was 73 or 74. They'd brought out some solo albums, they'd toured a lot, they'd brought out some greatest hits or compilations of earlier stuff. Rick Wakeman, who had left the group after Tales from Topographic Oceans, was back again, and so the group did a whole, had this big album Going for the One, big tours, all that kind of thing. Yes, we're still going strong, 1977, 1978. But what also starts to happen during this time is other groups start to come in who take the prog rock thing and maybe make it leaner, blend it in with blues rock a little bit more, in a way, maybe more prog heavy than what we said about Foreigner and Boston in the previous lecture. Now the basis of it seems to be prog music, prog rock, but kind of making it a little bit friendlier, more radio friendly by bringing in more kind of blues and pop song elements. And the two of the groups that really make a big difference in this regard are American groups, Kansas and Styx. Kansas, Left Overture, I think, is their 4th album from 1977, a number 5 record. Check me on that, on Left Overture. But the big one, sort of breakthrough album for them, number 5, as I say, and the single Carry On Wayward Son, number 11, really brings them to everybody's attention on FM rock during this period. And then the follow-up album, even better, even bigger, Point of No Return from 1978, number 4 on the charts here, with the song Dust in the Wind. The song that so many people who have bought acoustic guitars have learned to play in the years since. A number 6 hit for them in 1978. Styx, coming out of Chicago, led by Dennis DeYoung, has a big album, not their first album. Again, like Kansas, they'd done a few albums before this, but in 1977 they really hit big with The Grand Illusion. Maybe it's the addition of Tommy Shaw into the group, although I'm not sure this is his first one with the band. Certainly his presence is very much felt on The Grand Illusion. Number 6 record for them, the song Come Sail Away, a number 8 record. And both of these bands, Kansas and Styx, a lot of the kind of keyboard-based kind of stuff, synthesizers very much up front, but great hook-oriented vocals, and the guitars tend to be a little bit more blues rock than what you would find in most progressive rock. So you get a lot more of the sort of heavy guitars, spacey, classic-y sounding, classical-ish, if that's a word, classical-ish sounding keyboards, and then a kind of a sort of pop-oriented approach to the vocal hooks and the song forms that all sort of boiled down into forms 4 or 5 minutes long that will fit onto this now increasingly constrained but much bigger world of FM rock radio in the second half of the 70s. But, and I know there are some people who've been waiting for me to say this for all the weeks leading up to this, probably the biggest group for pushing progressive rock at the end of the 70s that comes onto the scene of the groups that aren't already established is the band from Canada. Yes, I'm talking about Rush. From Toronto, Geddy Lee, Neil Peart, and Alex Lifeson had previous radio success with tracks like Fly By Night from 1975, but the big concept album, 2112, from 1976, with the whole side of a record, that was just 2112, is often cited as a real important point of arrival for that band. They continue on into the out of the 70s with The Spirit of Radio, the track from 1980 that was on the radio all the time, Tom Sawyer on the radio all the time, 1981. The downside of all this for Rush was that just at the time when they were coming along with albums that had big, long, elaborate kind of songs, radio was constraining, and even groups like Yes couldn't get their long songs onto the radio. But they always had these hits that sort of permeated FM rock radio. And of course, Rush went on in the 80s and the 90s, and even most recently to be inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, to be one of the most enduring bands out of the late 1970s. So let's hear it for Rush. Other British bands that arise in the second half of the 70s, the Alan Parsons Project. Alan Parsons had been a recording engineer for the Beatles and for Pink Floyd, did the engineering on Pink Floyd's Dark Side of the Moon. He pulls together a group of studio musicians for a series of sort of concept albums from the second half of the 70s. I, Robot from 1977 is an important one from that period. The Electric Light Orchestra, run by Jeff Lynne, really kind of takes the Beatles songs with strings idea, Strawberry Fields Forever, I Am the Walrus, Glass Onion, tracks like that, and kind of turns it in to their own kind of style. And of course, Jeff Lynne is somebody very much respected by the Beatles. When the Beatles got back together in 1995, the three remaining Beatles got back together in 1995. Jeff Lynne did all the production on the two new tracks that they produced. When George Harrison formed the Traveling Wilburys, Jeff Lynne was a member of that. So very much part of the kind of Beatles tradition. The representative album, I would say, is El Dorado from 1975. It was a number 16 record with Can't Get It Out of My Head being the big radio single on that. But really anything after between 75 and 79, pretty good representation of what Electric Light Orchestra was up to. Another group that fits into this idea of groups that kind of continue earlier styles is Queen, fronted by Freddie Mercury and featuring guitarist Brian May, who was famous for the many harmonized guitars that created this sort of guitar chorus, very sort of classically oriented and observing principles of traditional voice leading and this kind of structure to make these fantastic guitar solos. The big breakthrough album for them, again, not their first one, was A Night at the Opera from 1976, which was a number 4 album for them and included the song Bohemian Rhapsody, which has gone on to be one of those songs like Stairway to Heaven or something like that becomes kind of emblematic of 70s rock radio. So Queen, of course, going on to have an enormous amount of success out of the 70s and then into the 80s as well, bringing together a real eclectic approach to different kinds of styles, something that you see Paul McCartney doing a lot in the second half of the Beatles' career, the late 1960s, putting together, as I say, the Brian May sort of harmonized guitars, and some elements of kind of classical playing, as we see in Bohemian Rhapsody and other kinds of Queen music. Let's talk now about the singer-songwriters, who by now, the second half of the 70s, were mostly fronting bands. When we talk about singer-songwriters, probably the best place to start is with Bob Dylan. And in the second half of the 70s, Dylan was very active, touring in front of a band. One of the big albums from that period, Blood on the Tracks, his number 1 album from 1975, featuring the song Tangled Up in Blue. Dylan, very much a feature of rock radio and the rock world in the second half of the 70s, turning to a kind of conservative religious, Christian religious kind of perspective toward the end of the 70s. I mention that not because I want to steer clear of anything that has to do with politics and religion in these courses, but just to say that Dylan is the kind of artist who will often remake himself. And you never really know whether the Dylan you're seeing is the real guy or whether it's a kind of a persona that he's constructed to to be able to deliver the songs. I actually think that's kind of the secret, is that whoever Bob Dylan is, the private Bob Dylan, we're never going to see that. We're only going to see the face that he chooses to show. So the face changes a little bit during the 70s for Bob Dylan. That's why I bring that up. Elton John continues with his success. Captain Fantastic and the Brown Dirt Cowboy from 1975, a big album for him, with the radio single Someone Saved My Life, a number 4 single. 2 songs that were recorded at about the same time, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds and Philadelphia Freedom, were never released on an album but were singles. Sometimes if you buy the CD package for the re-released Captain Fantastic album, you get those I think bundled in as bonus tracks for that. So Elton John has great success in the second half of the 70s. Paul Simon continues with his success. He brings out an album in 77 called His Greatest Hits, etc., where he has the song Slip Sliding Away included in that. New music included with his Greatest Hits collection, a number 5 hit. For me, the most interesting Paul Simon from the end of the decade is the album One Trick Pony. It was number 12 on the charts, released in 1980. The single was Late in the Evening, number 6 single. But I think those numbers sound pretty good, but I think it was a kind of a disappointing effort in the eyes of many people commercially for Paul Simon at the time. It was the soundtrack to a movie that he released called One Trick Pony. And the movie, I wouldn't say that it flopped, but it was not the success that he'd hoped. It was not A Hard Day's Night, okay? But it's a very interesting story. I think it's a very well-made music. He gets very well-made movie. He gets some fantastic musicians: Richard T., Eric Gale, Tony Levin, Steve Gadd are all in the band and in the movie. He's sort of touring around with and the tunes that he does are the most musically sophisticated, or at least in a sort of complex harmonic way, rhythmic way. The most musically sophisticated ones that he's done up to that point. They are a really fantastic point of arrival and really sort of put us together with groups like Steely Dan and some of the others who are using jazz elements in a sophisticated kind of, and the players he's got, I mean, they don't get much better than the guys he has on that record and who appear with him in the movie. So that's an interesting one from Paul Simon. The other singer-songwriters we'll talk about, all kind of, I'm going to place them all kind of with regard to their regional origins. So we'll have Billy Joel, Jackson Browne, Bob Seger, and Bruce Springsteen. Billy Joel, Long Island, New York, right? In 1973, he has an album and a song by the name of Piano Man, which make it onto the radio a lot, kind of his version of Harry Chapin in a lot of kinds of ways, very much influenced by Harry Chapin's style. But The Stranger from 1977 is the big album for him that kind of breaks through. It's number 2 on the charts, and Just the Way You Are, the song which was hard to imagine since it's been played by so many wedding bands in the past, in the time since, but at the time, it was a fantastically sort of atmospheric ballad, Just the Way You Are, before it turned into, like I said, to a wedding band classic. So Billy Joel, of course, goes on to have fantastic success into the 80s, and we'll return to him again when we talk about that. Jackson Browne, coming out of LA, had written Take It Easy with the Eagles, had a hit with Dr. My Eyes in 1972. His album Runnin' on Empty from 1978 is number 3, and really sort of launches Jackson Browne in many ways, or plays a role in launching him in the second half of the decades as a kind of performer in his own right, and not just a songwriter. So you've got Billy Joel bringing the Long Island sensibility to bear, Jackson Browne being the Los Angeles or the Southern California sensibility to bear, Bob Seger coming from Detroit, Michigan, right? His roots in Detroit going all the way back to the late 60s, where he had a series of regional hits. Did okay in the first half of the 1970s, but with the album Night Moves from 1977, he became a big star. That album number 8 and the title song Night Moves plus the song Main Street were both big sort of radio singles for him. A whole sequence of albums after that consistently go to the top of the charts and make him one of the most important singer-songwriters of the second half of the decade. So we've got Long Island, Los Angeles, Detroit. We come now to New Jersey. When we say New Jersey, we're almost also saying Bruce Springsteen, right? Bruce Springsteen has his first big success in 1975 with Born to Run. The title track itself being a kind of combination of Bob Dylan meets Phil Spector meets the Rolling Stones. Whatever's going on in that, it's a great sounding album, but it's not the biggest success that Bruce Springsteen will have. We'll really want to talk about Bruce Springsteen when we talk about the fantastic success he had during the 80s, but not so bad. Like I say, most bands would kill to have an album that's as successful as Born to Run, but Bruce Springsteen was just getting started. Well, as we think about this music from the second half of the 70s here, before we move on to punk and new wave, I'll leave it to you to decide whether you think this music constitutes a kind of synthesis of earlier things, maybe a further development, but also a synthesis of earlier stylistic things, or whether it constitutes a kind of homogenization. Is this an interesting period in which rock music is refined and made increasingly sort of lean and compact and lean and mean, or does it become so homogenized because everybody's shooting for the big album that it loses a lot of its original kind of visceral effect? Too many of the sharp corners are sanded down. It's a little bit too radio friendly. It's kind of been neutered in a certain kind of sense and no longer has the kind of edge, commitment, and authenticity that it had during the first half of the decade. I'll let you decide whether or not you think it's corporate rock or classic rock from the late 1970s. But for now, let's move on to punk. First, we'll turn to the United States.